Well, I'm sure you all know, the American Civil War took place between 1861 and 1865. And while most people and historians like to talk about the physical war that the soldiers fought, today I'll be talking more about the financial reasons why the Confederate States of America lost the Civil War. Now, in order to understand why the economy played such a large role in their loss, we will need a bit of context into the United States of America economy as a whole at the time of the mid-1800s. While the North and South were still unified under the United States in the mid-1800s, there were still very significant cultural and economic schisms between the two. For example, according to Christopher Bates' article, Economy 1850 to 1878, Southern economy at the time, at the beginning of the 1850s, was booming. They had exported more than $150 million worth of agriculture per year, which is about $5 billion worth of exports today. However, in 1857, the Northern Ohio Life Insurance Company closed its doors for the final time, never to reopen. The northern banks depended on this life insurance company to take money for life insurance policies, so without that money, banks suffered heavily, and the nation suffered a panic that would last until the start of the war. However, the South was pretty much unaffected by this panic, and in fact, by 1860, the South had increased its exports by nearly twice what they had been at the start of the decade, up from $150 million per year to 2 billion pounds of cotton, selling for $250 million per year, from 5 billion today to 8 billion today. According to the American Patent by David M. Kennedy, the South's primary trading partners were Britain and France. While the South had been so successful in cotton production and exportation that France and Britain had large surpluses of cotton. Unfortunately, this prosperity would not last too long. Once war was declared, Lincoln had set up a naval blockade of the Confederacy, preventing them from exporting their cotton. The South had counted on Britain and France on entering the war on their behalf, but they didn't. They didn't enter the war on behalf of the Confederacy because of the Emancipation Proclamation. At the outbreak of the war, it wasn't about slavery, it was about federalism. But as soon as Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in southern states, it became about slavery. Now, again according to the American Patent, because Britain and France had already abolished slavery themselves, there were strong public opinions on anti-slavery, so all prominent British figures, including the Prime Minister himself, sympathized with the Confederates. They could not take any military action, so the South received no military aid. To support the British and French, the Union Army seized or even bought cotton and other crops to send overseas to prevent them from joining the Confederates. I'm sure many of you have heard of the worthlessness of the Confederate dollar and how people at the time lined their houses with it as insulation because they couldn't afford proper insulation or wallpaper. According to the Emancipation Proclamation, Confederate Expectations and the Price of Southern Banknotes by Gary Peckwitz, according to his article, the federal treasury printed money. However, there is no unified dollar bill as we have it now. As you can see behind me, all those different monies look far different from each other. Only money backed by a certain amount of gold. This system was called the gold standard, and it held up pretty well by ensuring each banknote had a certain set value depending on what was printed on it. This encouraged the private trading of money. However, the South added its own money to the national supply in an attempt to generate revenue through money creation. They printed money to make more money. They eventually passed legislation to make these notes legal tender in the entire United States, allowing it to be traded and circulated along with privately issued gold-backed banknotes I mentioned earlier. This led to the Panic of 1860, and it led banknotes holders to redeem their banknotes for the gold that was promised to them. Hey Zane, how are you? However, because of all this fake currency was not backed by gold, when the holders of this fake currency tried to redeem it for specie, the banks couldn't supply all the gold for these banknotes, and gold quickly drained from the bank reserves, threatening the gold standard's stability. This caused every southern U.S. state, because they had still yet to recede, to freeze specie payments until the end of 1860. While this did stabilize the economy for a while, it caused the banknotes that had not been redeemed yet to trade below face value until the end of the specie freeze, when its value began to plummet even further. According to Inflating War, central banking and militarism are intimately linked. The South's financial decisions led to massive inflation during the course of the war. While the North had minor inflation, with their dollars being worth about 35 cents in gold, that's nothing compared to the South's inflation. Over the course of the war, they experienced inflation of 2,200% per year, and almost 9,000% inflation over the entirety of the war. According to Economy 1850 to 1878, once again, according to the Emancipation Proclamation of Confederate expectations in the price of Southern banknotes, not only did the South have no uniform currency, they also had no uniform banking system. Texas and Arkansas straight up prohibited banking. North and South Carolina had state-chartered banks, and every other state, being Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Virginia, all had free banking, meaning that any bank can issue their own banknotes with little to no regulations, which contributed to the problem of counterfeiting I talked about earlier. In February of 1861, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana all voted to leave the Union and join the Confederacy. A few months later, after the war had begun, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas also joined the Confederacy. Still, according to Christopher Bates' article mentioned at the beginning, neither the North or South were quite ready for the demands a war brings. The North was still suffering from the panic, and the South had no industrial capacity whatsoever. Neither side could afford to pay for a war. The North had the industry, but not the money, and the South had the money, but not the industry. When it came to financing the war, there are two reliable options: taxes and bonds. According to Brian Seaver's article, Confederate Currency, from the Historical Encyclopedia of American Business, the Confederate States of America were very strongly opposed to federalism, meaning they did not want a strong central government. This meant that voters did not want the government deciding how much they pay in taxes, and of course, given the option, nobody was willing to pay more taxes, so the Confederacy could get little to no money through taxation. According to Economy 1850 to 1878, while Southerners opposed strong opposition to taxation, the Confederacy managed to institute a small few taxes, such as raising income tax from 1 to 15%, and required farmers to turn over 10% of their crops to the government. However, tax evasion was so commonplace and these taxes were so poorly enforced that they ended up raising less than $150 million, and most of it ended up depreciated due to inflation by the end of the war. The Confederacy also tried selling war bonds for a total of $15 million of war bond sales, and the produce tax was so poorly enforced, prone to tax evasion, that farmers would just hoard their crops to feed themselves or even sell them to Union soldiers. The bonds were mostly only able to be sold at the beginning because as the Union Army rampaged across the South, money became harder to come by, and hyperinflation caused the currency to become worthless. The government was out of options, so they began printing currency. They printed $119 million worth of money in 1861 and $400 million in 1862. This caused the money to lose its value very fast for a variety of reasons, but mainly because there was just too much money in circulation. The government was also directly responsible for their banks failing. The Confederate government required banks to exchange specie for banknotes and bonds, and to give them loans. The other major source of bank investments were land slaves, but as the Union took more territory in the South, more slaves got freed, and the banks lost out on more money. But as the inflation continued, the banks lost their entire forced government investments and land slave investments, and unsurprisingly failed. After the war was over and the Union won, the country entered a period of reconstruction. Because every bank in the South had failed, they needed some major reform. According to The South and Problems of Civil War Finance, while Confederate loyalists put up significant resistance, their resistance ultimately failed to put any stops to the reform. The idea was to basically have a set number of national banks that would have a uniform currency, essentially eliminating most of the problems with Confederate currency. The idea was that every part of the country would have a certain amount of banks for each region, but New England threw their weight around and used it to obtain large portions of banks set aside for the South for itself. So the South had to pay back all loans, public and private, but with Confederate dollars being worthless and not having the banks back them up, the South had a hard time paying back those debts, but with the war over and the blockade lifted, the South slowly but surely started the road down to recovery. And behind me this entire time, I've had pictures circulating of Confederate currency that I got off of money trading and buying websites. And as you can see, none of them are quite the same like these two $5 bills here. Not quite the same, very different. And this one too. That's because the South had no uniform currency, so any Yahoo with a printing press could just take some money and print it out. And to show the inflation over the entire course of the war, I have this graph showing just what inflation took place according to the gold price data provided by the Richmond Civil War Centennial Committee in Richmond, Virginia. And as you can see, around 1863 is when it really started to spike up to about 700%. And then I couldn't find an exact reason for it, but this period where it dips down here is during Sherman's March to Sea, the largest offense of the war from the north, right from the south. And then as the Confederates starts to die in the last several months, inflation rises drastically to over 5,725%, as shown by this graph. Yeah, that's my presentation.